So we are talking about how to get your prayers answered quickly with our three examples of people who succeeded in doing that. Moshe, King Solomon, and Eliezer, the dark horse of the story in our parasha, who somehow manages to get his prayers answered really, really quickly, even though he's just Eliezer, he's not a big tzaddik. So yesterday we started speaking about the principle that maybe it's not the person who's praying, maybe it's what you're praying about. So to create a little bit of background, I touched briefly yesterday on the principle, which is the greater the distance, the longer the delay, which makes a lot of sense, that if you've got to deliver something from very far, it's going to take longer. So if a person is distant from Hashem, they must expect a longer period before they get their prayers answered. And if a person is closer to Hashem, they can expect it to be quicker. Now the Rambam actually says this. In his section, Hilchos Teshuvah, the laws of Teshuvah, the Rambam says, look how amazing Teshuvah is. He says, yesterday, this is the language he uses, yesterday, this individual was so distant from Hashem, and he would cry out to Hashem, and Hashem would ignore him. And today, meaning after the person has done Teshuvah, he's become close to Hashem, he's beloved to Hashem. That's the power of Teshuvah. Then, the Rambam takes it a step further, and he says that when a person does Teshuvah, that creates not just a closeness to Hashem, but he becomes mudbak, which means he becomes bound with Hashem. And when that happens, says the Rambam, tsoyek venene miyad, a person cries out to Hashem and davens, and Hashem answers them immediately. So the Rambam's telling you here that there's a scale. All right, there's different levels of closeness, and because of that, the different levels or different speeds of response.
But when I said yesterday about Teshuvah, you said that's not really prayer.
Correct. The Teshuvah is not the prayer.
Oh.
The Teshuvah isn't the prayer. But what he's telling us is that when a person does Teshuvah, it shifts the person so that now they have closeness to Hashem. So when they daven after they've done Teshuvah, then that davening will be answered much more quickly.
That sounds so simple.
If only, right? If only it was that simple to do Teshuvah. Especially that, because the Rambam's illustrating over here that there are obviously different levels of Teshuvah, because he says there's Teshuvah that makes you close to Hashem, and then there's Teshuvah that makes you bound with Hashem. And it's only when you get to the Teshuvah that you're bound with Hashem, then he says, as soon as you cry, Hashem answers. Now that's exactly what we're discussing over here, that there's a scale. Depending on how close a person is to Hashem, will determine how quickly they get a response from Hashem. So that already tells us that there is a method. Yesterday we asked the question, right? What's the method? How do you get Hashem to answer your prayers really quickly? Well, now we see that there is a method. Reconcile with Hashem. Be close to Hashem. And by the way, this is no different from any other relationship. If you think about it, if there's somebody who you are very, very close to, anything that you approach them with and that you ask them about, they're going to respond much more quickly than somebody you have nothing to do with. And if you don't believe that, go to any government office and try to get them to do what you want.
So how do you know if the Teshuvah that you're doing is what is the actual Teshuvah?
That's a good question. How do you know if your Teshuvah is real Teshuvah? So again, because it's a spectrum, that implies that there are different kinds of Teshuvah that a person could do, and it's possible that you could be doing valid Teshuvah and yet not be at that level of Teshuvah. That's also possible. So the basic Teshuvah is for a person to regret what they've done wrong, and then to make a clear resolution, which they then keep, about how they're going to do things differently. What that level of Teshuvah does is corrects the problem. Or to put it differently, what that level of Teshuvah does is it allows a person to no longer have a barrier between themselves and Hashem. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this person has reached the point of being bound with Hashem. That's going to take a whole different kind of Teshuvah. And generally speaking, we say that that is what we call the Teshuvah me'ahava, where a person is driven in their Teshuvah out of a love of Hashem rather than a fear of either disconnection or a fear of punishment, etc. So it's a very developed kind of Teshuvah, very advanced kind of Teshuvah. And then it makes sense, because if a person is driven by love, the nature of love is that you want to bond with somebody. You actually want to be as close as you possibly can. So if you're looking for a Teshuvah that's going to create a bond with Hashem, then it's got to be a Teshuvah which is motivated by love of Hashem. So it's not entry-level Teshuvah, certainly, that's going to get a person to that level that they are so close to Hashem. And the test, how you know that you're doing Teshuvah, which is driven by love, is where the nature of the Teshuvah is because of the missing time. In other words, there were things that I did that I wasn't supposed to do, or the things that I was supposed to do that I didn't do, or there was a period of time where I was disconnected, and I feel so deeply how much time I've missed or how many opportunities I missed. And that's what's driving me now to put in extra effort and to put in extra investment. So that would be teshuvah, which is driven by love, and that's the kind of teshuvah that would make a person actually feel this bond with Hashem.
And you might even be off the target with your teshuvah. You might be doing teshuvah for something that you think is a problem, but Hashem doesn't think that.
That's true. And to add to that, not only could you do teshuvah for something that doesn't need teshuvah, worse, you could not do teshuvah for something that needs teshuvah because you think that's not a big deal,
yes,
and I don't have to do teshuvah for it. So that's why a person should always have somebody who they consult. That's the concept of having a karav, a mashpia, somebody you can consult and say, okay, this is the thing that I'm dealing with. Is it an issue that needs teshuvah? And do some kind of a spiritual audit, because it'd be a terrible waste of time and energy to spend so much time doing teshuvah for something that doesn't need teshuvah and ignoring something that does need teshuvah. And because of human bias, we very often get that wrong. So it's quite useful to have somebody in the picture who can guide us. Okay.
Can I ask you a question? So you're talking about the scale, or let's call fear of God, love of God, awe of God, bond. I mean, where do you transfer between, okay, cool, I'm a good person, to, okay, wow, I've got fear and love of God, to, okay, I'm now bonded with.
So if we want to do a whole analysis of the various stages of teshuvah and of closeness to Hashem when it comes to it, it's going to need a lot of time.
Not that far. Yeah.
I'm just saying it's going to need a lot of time, and it's going to need more than what we're going to manage in the context of this particular share.
So then,
but let's say very simply this. Let's say very simply, a person who is distant from Hashem, whatever drives them in terms of their performance and in terms of their teshuvah, will be very self-interested. Because I'm not feeling close to Hashem, so I'm really caring about me. So why am I doing teshuvah? Because I don't want to be punished. Why am I doing teshuvah? Because I'm afraid that if I keep behaving this way, then my business is going to fail, or whatever the fears are that people have. That would be a very distant level of connection to Hashem. When a person reaches a point of teshuvah that is driven by love, then they are less self-focused, and they're much more interested, like a person who is in love. It's much more focused on the other person and what they care about and what they need. So then that would be a person whose state of commitment to Hashem is very focused on, well, what does Hashem expect of me now? And am I doing enough for Hashem? Rather than, am I getting the value out of doing something for Hashem? So that would be the easiest way to kind of create a sense of what that scale is. When a person is altogether committed to what Hashem wants and is totally disinterested in what's in it for them, that's when they've bonded with Hashem.
So we're talking about Moshe, Abraham.
Or we could be talking about a person who does teshuvah, which is exactly the Rambam's point, that you don't have to necessarily be a spiritual superhero. You just need to be somebody who's moved from one reality into a different reality. So the principle that we're learning is that if a person has this incredible closeness to Hashem, that they and Hashem are so to speak, bonded together, that's a person who can expect that their prayers will be answered really, really quickly, because they're, for lack of a better description, so close to Hashem that there should be no delay in delivery. But our conversation over here is to say we're going to translate that same principle and say, in the same way as the caliber of the person or the status of the person when they're davening is going to influence how quickly their prayers will be answered, in the same way the subject matter, and we touched on this briefly yesterday, the subject matter that they're davening about could also influence the speed of the response. So in other words, let's say that a person is davening, they're about to go into a big business meeting later today. So this morning, what they're davening about is, please God, let the business meeting succeed. The nature, the content of what they're davening about is not bonded to Hashem. The nature of what they're davening about is very much about themselves and their own life and their own needs. So you can't say that that is particularly close to Hashem, and therefore you should expect that Hashem has to answer me immediately. I mean, God is benevolent, so He might answer you immediately, but you can't have that expectation, because what you're davening for is not something that is, so to speak, for lack of a better expression, close to Hashem's heart. It's not necessarily close. It's my business. I care about it. And you could feed into that any personal request that an individual has. Just because I need it, just because it's important in my life, does not mean that it has to be a priority on Hashem's dispatch list. But if what I'm davening about is something which is meaningful to Hashem, again, for lack of a better word, something that is close to Hashem's heart, then you can expect that I'm going to get a quicker response, because if it's something that Hashem, quote unquote, cares about, then obviously He's going to deal with it really quickly. Now the question is, what does Hashem care about? And these are terrible expressions to use, almost humanizing Hashem to the point of what does Hashem care about? But what we do know is that the Torah gives us guidelines for what reason Hashem created the world. And if we understand anything that is related to that reason, and then we're davening for that, that's what Hashem cares about. So why did Hashem create the world? There are various suggestions that are made by various sages, and some of those suggestions are intriguing and beyond the scope of what we're going to speak about today. We're going to focus on one, which is the one that Chassidus focuses on the most. And I'm sure you've heard this before, which is that Hashem created the world because He wanted to manifest the most intense revelation of godliness in the most unlikely reality. So in the language of Chassidus, we call it dira, to make a home for Hashem, b'sachtoinim, in the lowest possible world. Now, just to understand for one moment what that means, when you talk about being at home, as opposed to being in a place where you could go to sleep at night, being at home means this is where I can be me. Nobody can dictate to me how I'm supposed to behave. It's my house. When I'm outside of my house, I have to conform to whatever the expectations are of society. So, for example, if I'm at a formal event, I have to dress a certain way, I have to behave a certain way, can't eat with my fingers, whatever the case is, right?
Can't skinny dip.
Exactly.
Really?
Right? All these things that you've got to do, right? So in a formal environment, you've got to behave in a particular way, right? And the truth is, even in an informal environment, there's certain acceptable norms of society. This is how you behave. When you're at home, it's your house, your rules. So when we say that Hashem is going to be at home in this world, currently Hashem is not at home in this world. Currently Hashem is behaving according to a protocol that He set up called creation. And the protocol of creation is a protocol where you don't notice Hashem 99.9% of the time, because He's hiding behind the protocols and the behaviors and the norms and the clothing, etc. So in order for Hashem to be at home would mean that Hashem is completely exposed in this world, that you can experience Hashem, that you can know Hashem without having to read about it in books. You can actually see it with your own eyes. Now, the least likely place for that to happen is here on earth, because out of all of the realms of creation, earth is the one that is the most limited by far, and it is also the one, when I say earth, I mean the whole physical universe, and it's also the only one that allows the possibility of denial of Hashem. So what that means is that Hashem's ultimate goal and purpose, so to speak, what's closest to Hashem's heart, is to harmonize absolute godliness with absolute limitation. That's the goal. So if there's any event in the course of history which is linked to that goal, that's going to be, so to speak, the things that Hashem prioritizes, and therefore those are going to be the most rapid responses to davening. So if we look at what Moshe was davening for, and we look at what King Solomon was davening for, we're going to see those themes. So we'll start with King Solomon because it's possibly the easiest one to identify that theme. When is King Solomon davening? At this particular point in time, we've already identified after he built the Beis HaMikdash, the temple. Now, the Beis HaMikdash, even though it was only in one place, it was only in Jerusalem, as opposed to what Hashem's ultimate goal is, which is to have revelation right across the entire universe. This was only in one little place. And Israel's not a big country, and Jerusalem's not a big city, and the Beis HaMikdash was not a big building. But what did happen in that Beis HaMikdash was this impossible fusion of infinite and finite, of the divine and the mundane. That was the whole purpose of the Beis HaMikdash. It wasn't intended to be this big fancy temple so that the Jewish people would have bragging rights when other nations would come traveling, in the same way as people today might go see other tourist sites. There were non-Jewish people at that time who came to see the tourist site called the Jewish Temple because they were fascinated by it. That's not the point. All right? It wasn't intended to put us on a pedestal. It was intended to be able to fuse godliness into this world. And we can prove that in two ways. Firstly, from King Solomon's own prayer, and secondly, from what happened inside the Beis HaMikdash. So in King Solomon's prayer, one of the things that he says is, Hashamayim u'shemei hashamayim lo yechalkelucha. If I had to take the heavens, and then the heavens above the heavens, which is a nice way of describing the spiritual realms, and then the higher spiritual realms, they would not be able to contain Hashem, even though they are very powerful, and they are much more advanced than we are. they could never contain Hashem. Hashem is overwhelming even for the highest spiritual realms that exist. And then he says, Af ki habayis hazeh, and yet this little structure called the Beis Hamikdash is going to contain the divine presence. So he's saying it rhetorically because he's saying this is an impossible reality. You can't fuse godliness into such a little space. To put it a little differently, Hashem is infinite and the Beis Hamikdash is very finite. How do I know it's very finite? Because it had to have exact measurements. And if the measurements were not right, or if the protocols were not right, then the Beis Hamikdash can't function. So if you don't, for example, bring the Tamid offering in the morning, and then you go off and bring another sacrifice, that sacrifice has absolutely no value because you didn't follow the finite steps of the exact protocol. And if the size and dimensions of any of the elements, whether it be the ark or whether it be the menorah, if they're not the right dimensions, they don't fulfill their function. So it's this incredibly ironic fusion of infinite God in a very, very finite space. And that's what Shlomo Melech is saying with one day. He's saying, how is this even going to work? I don't understand it. Nobody can understand it because it defies understanding. Which brings us to the second point, and that is that you actually had this experience when you went to the Beis Hamikdash. For example, the Mishnah tells us that there were 10 consistent miracles in the temple, even in the second temple period. And one of those consistent miracles was that they jam-packed people in to the extent that you literally could not move. You were like sardines. And yet when it was time to bow, which is not like we do on Yom Kippur, bowing in the Beis Hamikdash, you had to lie yourself flat on the ground with your arms out in front of you. So it was, this complete prostration. When they did that, suddenly there was enough space for everybody. That illustrates to you that you're living in an environment, or at least you temporarily in an environment that is in the physical world and not limited by the rules of the physical world simultaneously. And the best example of that was in the epicenter of the Beis Hamikdash, which was the Holy of Holies. That inside the Holy of Holies, if you took your tape measure or your laser measure and you measured from one wall to the other wall, it was an exact distance mandated by the Torah. And if you took the ark and you measured it from tip to tip, it was an exact measurement mandated by the Torah. And if that measurement was wrong, then the ark was disqualified or the room was disqualified. But then, when you measured from the edge of the ark to the wall, it was half the size of the room. And when you measured from the other edge of the ark to the wall, it was half the size of the room. So now you have this weird reality that the ark is not a hologram because you can measure it, and it actually takes up physical space. And at the same time that it takes up physical space, it doesn't take up physical space in the room, which is an indication that we're now living in an infinite space where the rules of life as we know it don't apply, at the same time that the rules do apply. Because at the same time that there are actual measurements, those measurements don't really operate in the way of normal measurements. That tells you we're living in a space of the fusion of absolute infinite godliness with a very finite reality. Now that's what Shlomo Melech is davening for. He says, I've built the structure, and now my prayer is that the structure should fulfill its purpose, which is that the divine presence should be manifest in this place, the fusion of the infinite and the finite, the thing, so to speak, that is closest to Hashem's heart, is that our world should accommodate godliness. Well, if that's what you're davening for, then the response is going to be immediate. And that's why as soon as Shlomo finishes his words, the fire descends onto the altar, which is the sign that the divine presence has now entered the space. Because what he was davening for is something that is high priority, it's the highest priority on Hashem's list. Therefore, it gets the quickest response. And we're going to see a similar thing with Moshe as well. Moshe and Korach are arguing not just simply about who's the boss. It's not that Korach is some kind of an egoist, although maybe he was, who's just looking for the limelight and it's not fair and why is Moshe the leader and then he makes his brother the Kohen Gadol, etc. That's part of what they're debating. But what lies much deeper in their debate is who is Moshe? Because if you think that Moshe is just another person like you and I, well then you could say he's taken all the roles for himself, he's playing a nepotistic game over here, putting his closest family into the positions of leadership, and then it's like any other political squabble. But that's not what's at stake over here. The debate between Korach and Moshe is a debate about what and who Moshe is fundamentally. The fact that he's not just an ordinary guy. That he's what?
He's Moshiach Shaliach.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he wanted Moshiach to be his Shaliach, but anyhow, that's another conversation, right? So the point is, who is Moshe? The Torah tells us, V'loi kam navi oid ke Moshe. Throughout the whole of our history, there never was and there never will be a prophet of the caliber of Moshe. So if you want to understand who Moshe is, he is the ultimate prophet. What's a prophet?
Servant of Hashem.
A prophet is the same fusion that you see in the Beis HaMikdash happening to a human being. Because what a prophet is a human with all of the limitations of a human. And as a prophet still has two eyes, a prophet can still catch a cold, right? A prophet is very much a human. He has to eat breakfast. He's a human being. Yet at the same time, what is the prophet doing? He's channeling Hashem to the people. And he's getting these messages not only like an ordinary prophet does. Maybe he has a vision, maybe he goes to sleep at night and has a dream. This is Moshe. Moshe is a unique prophet because, firstly, the Torah tells us, Peh el peh adaber boy. He speaks to Hashem face to face. Doesn't have to wait until he has a vision or an altered state of consciousness. He speaks to Hashem like normal. In other words, Moshe is talking to you, or let's use a better example. He's talking to the daughters of Tzlafchad, who have this whole crisis about what's going to happen to their family because inheritance seems to go down only the male line, and they have 5 daughters. And Moshe says to them, hold on, I'll ask Hashem, and I'll come back to you. He's got that level of access. So that means that there's no barrier between Moshe and the divine experience, because he doesn't have to go and sit and meditate like the Rambam describes most prophets would have to do, and sometimes even get themselves a musician, like the prophet Elisha would sometimes get a musician to put him into the right state of mind so he could have a prophecy. Moshe doesn't have those delays, which tells you he's obviously so close to Hashem that there's direct and uninterrupted flow of divine messaging right through him. Not only that, the sages tell us, Shechina medaberes mitoich groino shel Moshe, that when Moshe opens his mouth to speak, it's not Moses speaking. It's the divine presence speaking, and he's just the mouthpiece. So therefore, he is exactly what the whole of the purpose of creation is. He's the living human version of this. The fusion of godliness and our mundane world. So when somebody attacks that and says, I don't know if you are who you say you are, and maybe I also have a role to play over here, and I can challenge your authority, and now Moshe's got to daven for a clear indication that he is actually fulfilling this role of the fusion between infinite divine and limited human, his prayer is going to be answered immediately, because this is something which is very high on Hashem's priority list. And that becomes the template for how a person gets a prayer to be answered very rapidly. Either the person themselves has gone through a transformational experience, and now they're so close to Hashem, they're so bound to Hashem, that there's no delay, there's no barrier, there's no friction between themselves and Hashem, so therefore there's no resistance between the request and the fulfillment of the request. Or what the person is davening for is something which is so central to the purpose for which Hashem created the world. Central meaning because this is a time or an opportunity to be able to express that fusion of infinite and finite, of God and the world. So because what you're davening for is so absolutely important, that's what will speed up the prayer, which obviously then leaves us to the question, so why is Eliezer's request for a shidduch between 2 individuals? Yes, of course, they're great individuals, Yitzchak and Rivka, but how does that fit into this template? It's supposed to be something which is absolutely critical to the divine mission, which is the fusion of infinite and finite, God and the world. Where do you see that in the story of Yitzchak and Rivka? That would make it not only that Eliezer is answered immediately, but that he's answered even before he finishes his prayers, which seems to indicate that this is even more central to the theme and the concept of creation, even more than the Beis HaMikdash or the prophet Moshe. So that's what we'll have to learn next.